Today is Thursday, April the 8th. If you're watching this video today, you're likely a remote student. The in-person students are taking their STAR test today, which I believe you guys will be doing tomorrow. Tomorrow you will not have any sort of work to make up. Just continue watching the video, do what I asked for today, and you'll be in pretty good shape. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to finish up the PowerPoint we've been working on for the last several days. Once you finish watching this video, as I go over the PowerPoint, there's a brief kind of Cold War explained video in 15 minutes that I would like you to watch afterwards. I think this is a really good review for most of the things that we've talked about. Remember, your extra credit historical documentary review essay is due Friday before midnight. We also have the DBQ essay coming up that we've been talking about. That is open. I opened it up here this morning. Supposed to do it last night, but it just didn't work out that way. It is open. You can complete it at any point between now and, of course, Monday before midnight. Highly suggest you review these two documents first. There is the actual College Board AP History rubric that'll kind of explain what you need to be doing in your essay. There's also the scoring rubric that will kind of show you how the points relate to your actual grade on it. Remember, you are using the documents as evidence to support whatever argument you are forming. If you need to review the finer points of DBQ writing, if you scroll back, there's days where I explain it. We did one here relatively recently. You could also get on Heimler's History on YouTube. He has some really good videos that kind of break down the DBQ as well. Unit 8 DBQ essay is going to be your last major grade of the 6 weeks. So just kind of keep that in mind. That is due on Monday before midnight. Starting next week, we're going to start doing some AP exam prep tutorials. We're going to be doing those on Thursday after school for the next 4 weeks. Basically just going over different skills that you're going to need to be successful in the AP exam. These are entirely optional. We're going to have them both in person, but we're going to be doing it virtually as well at the same time. These are going to be Thursdays from April 15th all the way to May the 6th. If you can, please attend. They're going to last from about 4:30 to 5:15 each time. There's also going to be an opportunity for a mock exam coming up here soon. I'm going to open up an online mock exam. It's going to be open on Saturday, the 24th of April and Sunday, the 25th. You will have the freedom to complete that exam at any time over those 2 days. It is a lengthy exam, about 3 hours, I believe. I'd have to look at the times again. But you've got your multiple choice, you've got your SAQ, you've got your LEQ, you've got your DBQ. If you can complete this in those 2 days, because those are the only 2 days it's going to be open, if you complete the exam, I will give you 20 points of extra credit towards a test grade for the final 6 weeks. Also, I will give you a detailed breakdown of what you got on each section, and I'll kind of run it through our AP score calculator to let you know that if this was the real AP exam, approximately what sort of score you could expect. If you're taking the AP exam, I highly recommend you do this because it'll really be your only opportunity to get a feel for exactly how long the AP exam is and the caliber of questions that you're going to be facing. So those things are coming up. Be looking for an email where I'll kind of go over that as well. But yes, we are going to start those exam prep tutorials next Thursday at 4:30. Please attend. So let's go ahead and get started on the PowerPoint. Where we left off, it's the end of the Vietnam War. Very unpopular war in American history. It is another example of a proxy war where we're not fighting the Soviets, but we are fighting against communism and therefore kind of against their interests. After the war, we thought that if Vietnam fell to communism, that it would start a domino effect throughout Southeast Asia and perhaps elsewhere, where all of these countries would very quickly convert to communism. And while this did happen in Cambodia and Laos, it pretty much stopped there. But that does not mean that they were the only The Vietnam War was the only proxy war, of this time period. If you look at the map here, I mean, we were involved in a lot of proxy wars. The Soviet Union was involved in a lot of proxy wars where we would back one side of a conflict, they would back another. Sometimes we were directly fighting, sometimes they were as well. We just weren't directly fighting against each other. Again, the Cold War, just because we didn't actually wage war against the Soviets, does not mean it was free of conflict. There was an awful lot of conflict and some pretty sketchy things that went on during these years as well. Now, after the Vietnam War, things do start to ease up a little bit. There is an easing of tensions that starts in the 1970s. We call this détente. That's a good term to know. From the end of World War II through the presidencies of Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, and Bush, the Cold War was the central foreign policy concern. As we spoke about, earlier in the week, me growing up in the 80s, I grew up with, all the bad guys in the movies typically being Russians or sometimes Chinese, sometimes North Koreans, but a lot of times they were communists. Things do start to ease up, though. Better relations between communist countries and the U.S. began with one of the most hardline anti-communist presidents, Richard Nixon. In his only Nixon could go to China trip, Nixon was the first president to visit that communist country. So it's not the Soviet Union, who is our primary adversary in the Cold War, but easing relations with China show that we're willing to negotiate, we're willing to be diplomatic towards communist nations. Again, that's what détente was all about. Things are chilling out a little bit. In 1969, Nixon began negotiations with the USSR on SALT I, the common name for the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty Agreement. SALT I froze the number of ballistic missile launchers at existing levels and provided for the addition of submarine-launched ballistic missiles only after the same number of intercontinental ballistic missiles and other launchers had been dismantled. It was the first effort between the U.S. and the USSR to stop the increase of nuclear weapons. As we said, for the Cold War up to this point, it's an arms race where every year they're producing more and more powerful nuclear weapons to try to keep up with each other. SALT II was the second round of U.S.-USSR talks that took place between 1972 and 1979, which sought to reduce the manufacture of nuclear weapons. SALT II was the first nuclear treaty seeking real reduction in strategic forces to 2,250 of all categories on both sides. So getting into the 70s, things are looking a little bit better. The relationship is strengthening. But then, doggone it, we find ourselves in another proxy war. That takes place with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. The Soviets occupied Afghanistan for about 10 years. We are still occupying Afghanistan after our invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, although that is starting to taper off. Again, this is a situation where the Soviets were Afghanistan, there were rebels there fighting against them, and we're helping to arm those rebels, hence a proxy war. In the 1970s, the Soviet Union started providing financial assistance to their neighbor, Afghanistan. Over time, the Communist Party gained more power and influence there. In 1978, communist leaders took over the government. However, attempts at land redistribution and increasing the rights of women offended traditional Islamic culture. A group of Afghan rebels, the Mujahideen, began a guerrilla war against the communists. That resulted in the Soviet Union invading Afghanistan in 1979. However, the harsh terrain, the harsh climate made the war extremely difficult. The United States assisted the rebels by supplying them money, supplies, and weapons, making the conflict the last major proxy war of the Cold War. After spending billions of dollars each year and losing a large amount of expensive military equipment, the Soviet Union withdrew from the conflict in 1989. The conflict greatly damaged national pride and contributed to the economic collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Now, in the upper right-hand corner, you see a man with a beard who might look familiar to you. That is a picture of Osama bin Laden. He, in the early 2000s, was the leader of the terrorist organization known as Al-Qaeda. They're the ones that attacked us on September 11th, 2001. Greatest attack in American history on American soil. He is pictured there in this video of Afghanistan that's over this proxy war because he was actually a member of the Mujahideen that was fighting the Soviets that we helped supply and basically helped support. Many members of the Mujahideen end up, joining the Taliban, the same government that was in control of Afghanistan when we invaded. And that's the big irony. We helped these rebels fight the Soviets, but years later, we'd be fighting against them ourselves. It's really in the 1980s that you really start to see the beginning of the end of the Cold War. And a lot of that has to do with the respective leaders of our countries, the Soviet Union and the United States during this time period. In the Soviet Union, you had the progressive leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. And in our country, in much of the early 80s, you had Ronald Reagan. Reagan's foreign policy, they call it the Reagan Doctrine. You've got some pretty good quotes here that kind of describe his personality and his approach towards the Cold War. We maintain the peace through our strength. Weakness only invites aggression. Compromise like Reagan did. We win, they lose. Reagan set out to rebuild American confidence. He believed that the U.S. had to continue to act as the world's principal defender of freedom and democracy. 1983, Reagan sent Marines to the small Caribbean island of Grenada to prevent a communist takeover, showing his willingness to use force against communism. In 1985, the Reagan Doctrine was announced, stating that the U.S. would expand beyond the containment of communism. It stated that we would actively support anti-communist freedom fighters around the world, which we did, as we previously spoke about, in Afghanistan. We did it in Angola in Africa. We did it in Nicaragua in Central America. We also did it in Cambodia. The problem is freedom fighters as a term is very vague. And sometimes the groups that we supported were anti-democratic. Sometimes they were working to overthrow governments that had been elected that had communist leanings. So again, there's some pretty questionable behavior during this time period, but it just kind of shows the extent that we were worried about the spread of communism, and we're trying to contain it by any means necessary. Reagan believed in a philosophy of peace through strength. Let he who desires peace prepare for war. Reagan felt that the best way to prevent war was to make America's enemies think that the United States had both the means and the will to stop aggression. To carry out this foreign policy, he sharply increased military spending. He also proposed research into an anti-ballistic defense system, the Strategic Defense Initiative, codenamed, or nicknamed, I should say, Star Wars, using lasers to shoot down missiles in order to prevent a nuclear attack. These announcements disturbed Soviet leaders who feared the expense of developing their own system. Now, I'm not saying this was a complete con, but we probably couldn't have actually built that. But the belief that we could, the announcement that we were going to try, I mean, this really disturbed the Soviet Union because they knew that if we were able to complete this, something that they didn't have the time, money, or expertise to do themselves, we would almost permanently gain an edge in this ideological conflict. Mikhail Gorbachev becomes the Soviet premier and understands that the Soviet economy cannot compete with the West, partly because of Afghanistan and partly because of the costs of keeping up the military. Gorbachev recognized that there was increasing unrest in countries, and he introduced two major reforms. Glasnost, or transparency, essentially reducing censorship of the media, allowing more outside information into the Soviet Union. He allowed for greater freedoms. You know, people were a little bit more free in their speech. They had a little bit more choice in elections. There was also perestroika, or restructuring. He restructured the Soviet economy by introducing free market reforms, more private property and business ownership. Essentially, he made the Soviet Union less communist. As we talked about in previous days, you know, a lot of the communist nations you have today, like China, for instance, they did that as well, even earlier on. Here's the problem. Glasnost, you know, really kind of showed the Soviet people just how good the West had it compared to them. And it made them, you know, by and large, want to be more like us. And ultimately, that's the key to us winning the Cold War, if you want to say that. Our culture, you know, the things that we own, the things that we were able to do. I mean, the Soviet people, by and large, wanted those things for themselves. And Glasnost, you know, exposed them to that. Perestroika made those things more accessible. And, you know, once that started, I mean, it was really the end of communism as we know it in the Soviet Union. It was the end of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev was further pressured to reform the USSR when Reagan gave his speech in Germany, challenging Gorbachev to tear down this wall. Here's an excerpt of the speech. It's a pretty good one. We hear much from Moscow about a new policy of reform and openness. Some political prisoners have been released. Certain foreign news broadcasts are no longer being jammed. Some economic enterprises have been permitted to operate with greater freedom. Are these the beginnings of profound changes in the Soviet state, or are they token gestures intended to raise false hopes in the West? We welcome change and openness, for we believe that freedom and security go together. There is one sign the Soviets can make that would be unmistakable and advance the cause of freedom and peace. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And soon, that's more or less what happened. 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. A wave of rebellion against Soviet influence started to occur throughout its European allies in Eastern Europe. Poland's solidarity movement broke the Soviets' hold on that country. Hungary removed its border restrictions with Austria. Riots and protests broke out in Eastern Germany. East Germans stormed the wall. Confused and outnumbered, border guards did not fight back. The wall was breached. And eventually, through the people themselves rising up and taking sledgehammers and destroying this wall, well, that kind of led to East and West Germany no longer being divided and being officially reunited into modern Germany in 1990. Though unofficial, this was a symbolic, end of the Cold War. Like I said, the Berlin Wall, it had been a symbol of communist oppression. And when it came tumbling down, well, so did the Soviet Union. 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolves. On December 21st, 1991, the presidents of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus signed the Belavazia Accords, declaring the USSR dissolved and established the Commonwealth of Independent States in its place. On December 25th, 1991, Gorbachev yielded as the president of the USSR, declaring the office extinct. He turned the powers that until then were vested in him over to Boris Yeltsin, the first president of modern Russia. The following day, the Supreme Soviet, the highest governmental body of the Soviet Union, recognized the collapse of the Soviet Union and dissolved itself. This is generally recognized as the official final dissolution of the Soviet Union as a functioning state. And here you can kind of see all these territories that were part of the Soviet Union or controlled by the Soviet Union, kind of breaking apart and politically becoming independent. As we said early in the PowerPoint, Rocky IV comes out at the height or the last days of the Cold War. I guess you could say America won. Cold War is over, but is it? For a few years in the 1990s, it seems like we were doing pretty well with the Soviets, but getting into the 2000s, there's been increased tension seemingly year by year. Russia, under the rule of Vladimir Putin, while not communist, is still very authoritarian. Proxy wars, such as the Syrian civil war, still take place. There's all sorts of scandal that Russia's been accused of, from hacking governmental systems, perhaps meddling in elections. Who's to say who to believe? But the point is, our tension with Russia hasn't really ended, and perhaps this is just an extension of the Cold War or a new Cold War that we are currently engaged in. Hope you enjoyed the remainder of the PowerPoint. Like I said, there is a video after this I'd like you to watch that's going to review a lot of the things that we talked about throughout the week. The DBQ essay, it is connected to this. I think a lot of the things that you took notes over, could potentially help you, especially with providing outside information for the essay. Obviously, if you have any questions or you need anything, let me know. We got about a week left of the 6 weeks. Check your grades. Ensure you've done everything that you can to be successful in this class. Thank you so much. Bye.